She traveled 2,000 miles for a wedding, only to be abandoned in the freezing wilderness. Left for dead, she stumbled into the cabin of a bleeding, solitary mountain man. What happened next wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a twist of fate that changed the frontier forever. The Union Pacific train hissed a plume of bitter white steam into the October air, grinding to a halt at the edge of the world. Or at least that was how Pine Bluff, Idaho Territory, appeared to Margaret Prescott. She stepped down onto the rough-hewn wooden platform, adjusting the collar of her wool traveling suit to block the biting wind. She held a worn leather satchel in one hand and a crumpled letter in the other. The letter was from Josiah Higgins, a man who had promised her the world in sprawling cursive ink. Back in Boston, Margaret had been a seamstress, drowning in the grief of losing her parents to cholera and suffocating under the weight of mounting debts. Josiah's advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like a lifeline. He wrote of a thriving homestead, a valley filled with wildflowers, and a respectable life in the West. But as Margaret looked around the muddy, chaotic thoroughfare of Pine Bluff, she saw no wildflowers. There were only false-fronted saloons, overworked pack mules, and men with hardened faces who stared at her with unsettling intensity. "Excuse me, sir," Margaret said, approaching a man sweeping the boardwalk outside a general store bearing the name Caleb Ward's Provisions. "I am looking for Mr. Josiah Higgins. I am his fiancé." Caleb Ward stopped sweeping, leaning heavily on his broom. He looked at Margaret, his eyes traveling over her refined, albeit dusty, Eastern clothing. A look of profound pity washed over his weathered face. "Miss, I don't know how to tell you this, but Josiah Higgins ain't here, and he ain't coming back." Margaret's heart dropped into her stomach. "What do you mean? We are to be married tomorrow, at the parish." "Josiah Higgins was a liar and a cheat," Caleb said gently, though the words struck like a physical blow. "He didn't own no homestead. He was a low-level prospector who spent more time at the faro tables than panning the creeks. A week ago, he ran up a $1,000 debt with a notoriously dangerous man named Black Jack Montgomery. When Montgomery's men came to collect, Higgins stole a horse and fled in the dead of night, left town with nothing but the shirt on his back." Margaret staggered, the world tilting violently on its axis. "But my passage, my trunk, I have exactly $3 to my name. I'm sorry, miss, truly, but Pine Bluff ain't a place for a lady alone, especially not with winter breathing down our necks. The last stagecoach out of the territory left 2 days ago before the snows locked the pass. You're stranded here until the spring thaw." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. She was utterly alone, 2,000 miles from home, tied to the phantom promises of a coward. The town boarding house, run by a sour-faced woman named Mrs. O'Leary, demanded $2 a week, money Margaret simply did not have. Desperation is a powerful catalyst, and as the afternoon sky turned the color of bruised iron, Margaret made a dangerous, perhaps foolish, decision. Caleb had mentioned that Josiah had squatted in an abandoned trapper's shack about 3 miles up the ridge near Widow's Peak. It wasn't much, but it was a roof. If she could just reach it, she could shelter there, perhaps find some provisions he left behind, and figure out a way to survive. Against Caleb's desperate warnings, Margaret bought a lantern, matches, and a small loaf of hardened bread with her last few coins. She set out on foot just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Within an hour, the light snow turned into a blinding, ferocious Rocky Mountain blizzard. The wind shrieked through the towering pines, a deafening roar that swallowed her cries for help. Hypothermia began to set in. Her hands and feet went numb, and a dangerous, warm lethargy crept into her mind. "Just lie down," the whispering wind seemed to say. "Just close your eyes." She fell to her knees at the base of a massive cedar, ready to surrender to the freezing dark. But then, a faint scent caught the wind. Wood smoke. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She forced herself up, dragging her frozen limbs forward through the howling whiteout. 10 yards, 20 yards. Then, the dark, solid shape of a log cabin emerged from the storm. There were no lights in the window, but the chimney released a thin, sputtering trail of smoke. "Josiah!" she screamed, though her voice was barely a croak. She practically threw herself against the heavy timber door. It was unlatched. She tumbled inside, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards as the wind slammed the door shut behind her. She lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the silence of the cabin overwhelming after the roar of the storm. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the dying embers in the hearth, a new, horrifying realization took hold. The air was heavy, metallic, and sickeningly sweet. It was the undeniable smell of fresh blood. Margaret scrambled backward, her hands slipping on something warm and wet pooling on the wooden floor. She fumbled wildly for the matches in her pocket, her trembling, frozen fingers barely managing to strike a flame against the stone hearth. She lit her lantern, raising the flickering amber light to illuminate the room. It wasn't Josiah Higgins' shack. It was a fortress of survival. Heavy furs lined the walls, traps hung from the rafters, and hunting rifles sat meticulously racked. And there, in the center of the room, lay a man who looked more like a fallen mountain than a human being. He was massive, with broad shoulders and a thick, dark beard matted with sweat and dirt. But it was the horrifying state of his body that made Margaret gasp aloud. A deep, jagged knife wound ripped across his heavy leather coat, exposing the muscle of his thigh, while a dark, arterial stain spread rapidly from a gunshot wound high on his right shoulder. He was unconscious, his breathing a wet, shallow rattle in his chest. This was Jonas Ridge. Though Margaret did not know his name yet, the town of Pine Bluff whispered of him in hushed, fearful tones. He was a solitary mountain man who traded furs and gold dust twice a year, a man who bowed to no one and answered to the wilderness alone. Margaret had never seen a dead body outside of a parlor casket, let alone a man dying violently in a pool of his own blood. Her instincts screamed at her to flee back into the storm, but the blizzard outside meant certain death, and if she stayed and did nothing, she would be sharing a cabin with a corpse by sunrise. "God give me strength," Margaret whispered, her Boston-bred refinement burning away in the crucible of the frontier. She was no longer a discarded mail-order bride. She was this man's only chance at life. She stripped off her freezing, snow-caked coat and rolled up her sleeves. The first priority was the bleeding. She rushed to the hearth, throwing more logs onto the dying embers to build up the fire. She found a cast-iron kettle, filled it with snow from right outside the door, and set it to boil. Rummaging through the cabin, she found a wooden chest containing clean linen shirts. Without hesitation, she tore them into long bandages. When she knelt beside him, the sheer size of him was intimidating. She carefully unbuttoned his blood-soaked shirt, exposing the gunshot wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through the meat of his shoulder, missing the bone, but it was bleeding profusely. The knife wound on his thigh was worse deep and dangerously close to an artery. The water boiled. Margaret sanitized a small hunting knife she found on the table and retrieved a bottle of harsh, cheap whiskey from a shelf. "I am so sorry, sir," she murmured, though he couldn't hear her. She poured the raw whiskey directly into the shoulder wound. Jonas's eyes flew open a piercing, startling shade of ice blue. He let out a primal, deafening roar of agony, his massive body thrashing against the floorboards. His heavy hand shot out, wrapping around Margaret's throat with terrifying, unyielding strength. In his delirium, he was back in the ambush, fighting for his life against the men who had shot him. "No!" Margaret choked out, clawing at his thick, calloused fingers. Her vision began to spot with black. "I am helping you." The urgency and terror in her voice seemed to pierce through the fog of his pain. He blinked, the murderous rage in his eyes dulling into confusion as he took in the sight of the petite, terrified woman in his cabin. His grip loosened, and his eyes rolled back in his head as he passed out once more. Margaret fell back, gasping for air, rubbing her bruised throat. Tears pricked her eyes, but she angrily wiped them away. She couldn't afford fear right now. She spent the next agonizing hour cleaning the wounds. Knowing she had to close the deep gash on his leg, she found a bone needle and thick sinew thread in his supplies. With shaking hands, she stitched the jagged flesh together, her stomach violently protesting the gruesome task. Finally, she bound both wounds tightly with the torn linen. By the time she finished, she was exhausted, covered in his blood, and shivering uncontrollably in her damp clothes. Using all the leverage she could muster, She dragged Jonas's heavy, unconscious frame onto a thick, bare rug closer to the radiating heat of the fire. She covered him in heavy wolfskin blankets, then finally collapsed into a wooden rocking chair, falling into a dead, dreamless sleep. For the next 4 days, the blizzard raged outside, locking them in a frozen, silent world. And for 4 days, Jonas Ridge fought a terrible battle against infection. A violent fever took hold of him. He sweated through the blankets, thrashing and muttering in delirium. Margaret rarely slept. She became a machine of survival, feeding the fire, melting snow for water, and pressing cool, damp rags to his burning forehead. She found a sack of dried oats and cooked thin gruel, spooning it past his cracked lips drop by drop to keep him hydrated. During his fever dreams, he spoke brokenly. He cursed men named Montgomery and Higgins. Margaret froze when she heard her treacherous fiancé's name drop from the mountain man's lips. Higgins. She pieced it together slowly. Josiah hadn't just run away from a gambling debt. He had sold out this mountain man. He had led Montgomery's thugs up the ridge, ambushing Jonas to steal his gold stash to pay off his own debts. Josiah had traded this man's life to save his own miserable skin. Guilt, sharp and heavy, settled over Margaret. Though she had done nothing wrong, she felt inexplicably tied to the crime because of the ring she still wore on a string around her neck. On the morning of the 5th day, the howling wind finally died down. Sunlight, blinding and pure, streamed through the single, frost-covered window of the cabin. Margaret was sitting by the hearth, her head resting on her knees, dozing lightly. A deep, gravelly voice broke the silence. "What in the hell are you doing in my cabin?" Margaret snapped awake. Jonas was awake. His face was pale and drawn, but his ice-blue eyes were clear and fiercely alert. He was clutching the blanket to his chest, wincing as he tried to shift his weight. He looked at her not with gratitude, but with intense, suspicious hostility. Margaret stood up slowly, her chin lifting in defiance despite her exhaustion. She was covered in soot and dried blood, her hair a wild, unpinned mess. She looked nothing like a Boston seamstress, and everything like a woman who had fought death and won. "I am saving your life, Mr. Ridge," Margaret said, her voice steady. "And judging by your lack of manners, I'm beginning to wonder if it was worth the effort." The silence that followed Margaret's retort was thicker than the frost on the window pane. Jonas Ridge stared at her, his jaw muscle ticking beneath his heavy beard. He tried to push himself up on his good arm, but a fresh wave of agony washed over him, turning his face a sickening shade of gray. He collapsed back against the bear rug, a harsh string of curses escaping his lips. "Don't move," Margaret commanded, her voice surprisingly firm. "Your leg has 20 stitches in it, and your shoulder lost enough blood to kill a draft horse. If you tear those wounds open, I will not sew them back together." Jonas glared at her, but the sheer exhaustion in his eyes betrayed his tough exterior. "Who are you?" he rasped. "And how did you get past the ridge?" "My name is Margaret Prescott," she said, pouring a cup of tepid water from the kettle and bringing it to his lips. He hesitated, then drank greedily. "I walked here from Pine Bluff in the blizzard. I was looking for a man named Josiah Higgins. I am to be his wife." At the mention of the name, Jonas's massive frame went rigid. His eyes darkened like a thunderhead. With a sudden, startling burst of strength, his left hand shot out and clamped around Margaret's wrist. "Higgins," Jonas snarled, his breath hot and smelling of fever and whiskey. "You're with that cowardly rat?" "I am not with anyone," Margaret shot back, struggling against his grip, though it was like trying to pry apart iron bands. "I arrived on the Union Pacific yesterday. He abandoned me. He fled town." Jonas's grip loosened slightly, a bitter, barking laugh escaping his chest. "Fled town. I reckon he did. After he led Jack Montgomery's cutthroats right to my trapping line." Jonas fell back, his chest heaving. "I spent 6 months in the Bitterroots. Had 50 ounces of placer gold and 100 prime beaver pelts. Higgins knew where my cash was. He owed Montgomery a gambling debt. The rat sold me out to save his own neck. They ambushed me at the creek, took everything, left me for the buzzards." The horror of the truth settled over Margaret like a suffocating blanket. Josiah hadn't just been a liar and a cheat. He was an accessory to attempted murder, and she had traveled across the country to bind her life to his. With a trembling hand, Margaret reached under her collar. She pulled out the cheap brass engagement ring Josiah had sent her in the mail, suspended on a piece of twine. She looked at it for a long moment, feeling the last vestiges of her naive, Boston-bred innocence wither away. Without a word, she snapped the twine, walked over to the roaring hearth, and tossed the ring into the flames. Jonas watched her, his piercing blue eyes tracking her every movement. The hostility in his gaze slowly morphed into a quiet, grudging respect. "Winter's here, Miss Prescott," Jonas said softly, the fight draining out of him. "The pass is snowed in tight. Wells Fargo won't run a stagecoach through here until April. You're trapped." "Then we will survive until April," Margaret said, rolling up her sleeves and picking up the heavy cast-iron poker to stoke the fire. "Tell me what needs to be done." And so began a brutal, grueling education in frontier survival. For the first 3 weeks, Jonas was bedridden, fighting off the lingering infection. Margaret became his hands and his feet. Under his gruff, exacting directions, she learned to venture out into the freezing lean-to behind the cabin to carve frozen meat from the elk carcass he had strung up before the ambush. She learned the horrifying, bloody work of skinning rabbits caught in the snare lines close to the cabin. She chopped firewood until her hands were a mass of bleeding blisters, which eventually turned into thick, hardened calluses. It was a grueling existence, stripped of all Victorian propriety. There were no parlors, no polite society, no tea times. There was only the howling wind, the biting cold, and the desperate daily chore of staying alive. As December rolled into January, Jonas finally began to walk again, relying on a thick ashwood cane. The first time he managed to stay on his feet for more than a minute, Margaret actually wept with relief, hiding her tears by turning her face toward the stove. With Jonas mobile, the burden of labor shifted, but the cabin fever grew. They were two fiercely independent people locked in a 12 by 12-foot box. They argued over everything: how to season the stew, how much wood to burn at night, how to clean the Springfield rifle. But beneath the bickering, a profound shift was occurring. Jonas watched Margaret transform from a pale, terrified Easterner into a woman of the West. He watched her chop a cord of wood with a rhythmic, steady focus. He watched the firelight dance across her face as she painstakingly mended his torn leather coat with her expert seamstress skills. For Jonas, a man who had isolated himself from the world after witnessing the horrors of the Civil War as a scout under General Philip Sheridan, Margaret was a revelation. She didn't look at him with the fear that the townsfolk of Pine Bluff did. She looked at him as an equal. One evening in late February, as a fresh storm battered the roof, Margaret sat by the fire, shivering despite her wool shawls. Her thin, city-made leather boots had completely rotted through from the snow and damp. She was trying to stitch scraps of canvas around her freezing toes. Jonas watched her from across the room. He slowly stood up, walked over to his heavy wooden trunk, and pulled out a bundle of soft, beautifully tanned buckskin and a roll of thick rabbit fur. He sat down heavily on the floor beside her. "Give me your foot," he rumbled. Margaret blinked, pulling her foot back defensively. "I am perfectly capable." "Give me your foot, Margaret," he said, using her first name for the first time. His voice was remarkably gentle. Reluctantly, she extended her foot. His massive, scarred hands were surprisingly tender as he measured the length of her foot against the buckskin. For the next 3 hours they sat in companionable silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic pull of his awl and sinew. By midnight, he handed her a pair of knee-high, fur-lined moccasins, meticulously stitched and watertight. Margaret slipped them on. They were the warmest, most comfortable things she had ever worn. She looked up at him, her heart doing a strange, fluttering rhythm in her chest. "Thank you, Jonas," she whispered. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, his rough thumb gently brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly thick. For a moment, she thought he was going to lean in and kiss her. But the ghosts of his past and the walls of his isolation were still too high. He abruptly stood up, cleared his throat, and went to check the locks on the door. But the shift had happened. The ice had broken. As the long winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, They were no longer just survivors sharing a shelter. They were two halves of a whole, bound by the blood they had spilled and the cold they had conquered. By mid-April, the Bitterroot Mountains began to weep. The heavy snowpack surrendered to the warming sun, turning the frozen creeks into roaring, muddy torrents. For Margaret, the arrival of spring brought not joy, but a deep, aching dread. The pass was clearing. Soon, the Wells Fargo stagecoach would carve its way through the valley, bringing the outside world back to their isolated sanctuary. Jonas spent his days repairing traps and scouting the ridge, his silence heavier than usual. The unspoken truth hung between them. She was a Boston woman, and he was a creature of the wild. Her time here was supposed to be temporary. On a bright Tuesday morning, the decision was ripped from their hands. Margaret was kneeling by the creek, scrubbing soot from a cast-iron skillet, when the sharp, violent crack of snapping pine branches echoed through the canyon. She stood, dropping her brush. 4 men on horseback burst through the tree line, riding hard. Their horses were lathered in white foam, eyes rolling in panic. At the head of the pack, clutching the reins with desperate white-knuckled hands, was a man in a crushed bowler hat. Josiah Higgins. Beside him rode a massive, scarred brute with a black leather patch over his left eye, Black Jack Montgomery. They were fleeing a territorial posse, pushing their exhausted mounts toward the cabin to fortify. Josiah yanked his horse to a halt when he spotted the lone woman by the water. He blinked, rubbing a dirt-caked hand over his eyes. "Abby," he breathed, his voice a sickening mix of shock and twisted relief. "Well, I'll be damned to hell." The little Boston bird survived. Margaret stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs, but Montgomery spurred his massive roan stallion forward, cutting off her path to the cabin door. He leaned from the saddle, his one good eye raking over her form. "Who is this, Higgins?" Montgomery growled. "She ain't one of Ridge's whores. The bear lived alone." "She was my fiancée," Josiah sneered, dismounting. "Seems she found her way up here after I left. Since Ridge bled out, she's just been squatting in his cabin." "Please," Margaret choked out, backing toward the freezing water. "Josiah, you left me to die. Let me go." Josiah let out a cruel, high-pitched laugh. "Let you go? Abby, you are my ticket out of the red. Montgomery, you said you needed fresh girls for the Silver Slipper over in Virginia City. Take her. Consider my debt fully paid." Margaret's stomach violently heaved. He was selling her into frontier slavery to save his own miserable hide. Montgomery grinned, exposing rotted teeth, and lunged down to grab her hair. A deafening crack split the morning air. Montgomery's bowler hat flew off his head. A perfect half-inch hole punched cleanly through the brim. The 4 men froze. Emerging from the heavy timber, stepping into the sunlight like a vengeful spirit of the mountain, was Jonas Ridge. He held his Winchester 1873 to his shoulder, the barrel smoking. He was a terrifying sight, massive, clad in buckskin. His ice-blue eyes burning with a murderous, unholy rage. "Get your filthy hands away from my wife," Jonas roared, his voice bouncing off the granite cliffs. Margaret gasped. Wife. The word hung in the air, heavy and fiercely protective. "Ridge!" Josiah shrieked, stumbling backward into the mud. "You're dead! We watched you bleed!" "You didn't watch close enough, you miserable rat." Jonas racked the lever, chambering a new round. "Drop your iron." The 2 hired guns behind Montgomery drew their 6-shooters. Jonas moved with terrifying, fluid speed. He fired twice in a heartbeat. Both men fell from their saddles, clutching shattered shoulders. Montgomery pulled his revolver and fired wildly. The bullet grazed Jonas's ribs, tearing his shirt, but the mountain man didn't flinch. He dropped the empty rifle, drew his heavy Colt hunting knife, and charged. He slammed into Montgomery, tackling the massive outlaw off his horse. They hit the earth with a bone-jarring thud. Montgomery was a notorious brawler, but fighting Jonas was like fighting a grizzly. Josiah Higgins, paralyzed by cowardice, turned and fled toward the swollen creek. "Josiah, stop!" Margaret yelled. "The water is too fast." He didn't listen. He plunged into the freezing, churning rapids. The spring melt was merciless. The undertow caught his heavy boots, and with a gargling, pathetic scream, Josiah was swept under the foaming white water, his head smashing against a submerged boulder. The mountain had claimed its debt. Jonas stood up, chest heaving, wiping blood from his cheek. He tied Montgomery's hands tight, then walked over to Margaret. His fierce demeanor softened instantly. He gripped her shoulders, his eyes frantically scanning her face. "Did they hurt you?" he demanded. "No," she breathed, her voice shaking. "Jonas, you called me your wife." Jonas dropped his hands, suddenly looking down at his muddy boots. It was the first thing that came to mind to make them back off. He turned, walked into the cabin, and emerged moments later holding a heavy, oiled leather pouch. He pressed it into her trembling hands. "What is this?" she asked. "The secondary cash," Jonas said quietly. "The gold Higgins didn't know about. There's enough in there to buy a first-class ticket back to Boston. Enough to open a dress shop, to buy a house in a polite neighborhood." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with heartbreaking resignation. "You gave up your winter, your safety, for a bleeding stranger. Consider the debt repaid." Margaret looked at the fortune in her hands. It was everything she had dreamed of when she first boarded the train. But as she looked at the rugged, scarred face of the man who had just fought an army for her, she realized Boston was a city of ghosts. True security wasn't in a bank vault. It was in the calloused hands of Jonas Ridge. Margaret slowly opened her fingers. The heavy pouch dropped into the mud. Jonas blinked in shock. "What are you doing? That's your ticket home." "I am already home," Margaret said fiercely. She stepped forward, weaving her fingers into his thick beard, and pulled his face down to hers. When their lips met, it was the breaking of the spring thaw, a rushing release of everything held back for 6 months. Jonas groaned, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet. He kissed her with a consuming hunger, pouring his fiercely guarded heart into the embrace. The mail-order bride had come west, seeking a phantom promise, but she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had healed the broken mountain man, and he had given her his soul. Did Margaret make the right choice staying in the unforgiving frontier, or should she have taken the gold and run back to Boston? Let us know what you think of this wild Western romance in the comments below. If you love this story of survival, betrayal, and unexpected love, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life storytelling.